Thank you. Chairman Cummings, I don't want to make it harder for people to vote. I just want to make sure that elections are fair and that only eligible voters vote. I'm from rural Kentucky. Many elections, this past election cycle, were decided by 10 votes or less. But I have a huge problem with the proposal for same-day voter registration. What I witnessed in California this past federal election cycle with the questionable ballot harvesting gave me grave concerns about the integrity of our elections and who is actually casting votes in some states that have passed this type of version of election reform. So I want to ask my first question to Mr. Smith and to touch upon what Congressman Heiss mentioned. This proposal, one of the things it does is it removes the standard of the chairman and vice chairman being from separate parties. In Kentucky, we have a board of elections, and it's split down the middle. Kentucky, it's half Republican, half Democrat. How might consolidating power in the hands of a single party and a chairman of a single party undermine the legitimacy of the Federal Election Commission?
Right. Well, as I mentioned earlier, historically, it's required bipartisanship. There has to be some degree of buy-in from one commissioner who's identified with the other side of the aisle, and that disappears here. As we pointed out, the in theory, independent commissioner doesn't need to be truly independent, but it's even worse than that, actually, because if the president simply doesn't fill certain positions, then a three-member quorum, which could be two members of one party and one independent or something, could be free to launch whatever investigations it chose past the regulations. The regulations that you pass, of course, can be terribly biased in favor of one party or the other, but also the enforcement process, the priorities you choose, how you choose to go after people, whether you choose to pursue certain folks can be very damaging. And as I pointed out, oftentimes the punishment is in the process itself. You get bad press, your resources become tied up, and this can be on charges that are very bogus, that have almost no real foundation in fact. So a partisan FEC is a very dangerous potential weapon, and it's worth noting that groups that, you know, from time to time the FEC will get criticized. Republicans will say something like, you know, this is a biased agency. And the very first response that always comes out of the mouth of people like some of the organizations represented down the table here is, requires some degree of bipartisanship, right? See, they themselves know that that's really the only thing that gives the agency its legitimacy, is that bipartisan makeup.
Right. Following up on that, this proposal, H.R. 1, also allows the general counsel to initiate an investigation without bipartisan support and issue subpoenas on his own authority. Does the bill provide sufficient checks on the general counsel to make sure this significant authority is not abused?
Well, I don't think it does. I mean, there is the possibility for the Commission to override the General Counsel's actions, but if the Commission doesn't act, doesn't have time to act, for some reason or another can't muster a quorum, the General Counsel can simply plow ahead. Plus, it allows the Commissioners themselves to dodge any responsibility. They can simply not vote and let the General Counsel's recommendation move forward. And note that first General Counsel will be appointed by the chair with concurrence of two other commissioners. He doesn't need concurrence of two others for this, but those will all be people appointed by this first president who makes that appointment. And once he's in, he can stay in indefinitely unless you can muster a majority to vote him out.
Right. Let me ask you this last question. The asserted purpose of H.R. 1 is to increase transparency in the electoral process. I think we would all support that. But in what way does creating a secretive, taxpayer-funded blue ribbon panel to lobby the president about whom to appoint to the FEC increase transparency?
Well, this is a fascinating little part of the bill. One part of the bill requires the creation of this blue ribbon panel that's supposed to make recommendations to the president as to whom he ought to appoint to the FEC. It's not quite clear what the purpose of the panel is, since they don't have binding authority, but it is very interesting that the first thing the bill does then is take this body out of the requirements of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which exists precisely to make sure that it operates transparently and it allows it to operate in secret.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rutter.